Hello and welcome to Amiga Reviews with me, the eager Amiga Eagle, in the literal sense. Today I'm going to be casting a look back at a game that I spent a lot of time playing on my precious Amiga 500 Plus in my equally as precious yet completely wasted youth. Now, I would argue that the days of the Amiga were some of the most creative and innovative times in video game history. While many would argue that Sega and Nintendo were equally as innovative, licenses and other such barriers needed to be overcome to get games onto those consoles. The Amiga, much like the PC today, was an open platform that anyone could program for. As a result, a lot of games were created by enthusiasts in their back rooms, using the tools that they had available to them. There were always going to be a few duds, but some of the results were nothing short of spectacular. While this may have started on the likes of the C64, the Amiga was where the wave of innovation really hit its first peak. The graphics, the music, the gameplay, and indeed some of the game concepts that graced the early 16-bit era were what took my love of computer games from a passing interest to an obsession. Simple 3D games had been around in the arcade for over a decade by this point, but they were using specialised hardware that domestic devices just could not replicate around that time. The early 90s is when the first wave of fully 3D games really started to take off on home computers. It may have been overshadowed by certain other 2D games such as Street Fighter II, Sonic and Mario, but nevertheless, it was happening. The current wave of 16-bit hardware enabled an admittedly rudimentary smattering of polygon-based titles, and people were discovering what they could do. If you have seen my Hunter retrospective, you would already know this. Don't worry if you haven't. No, actually, you should worry. Go and watch it. Now. Don't worry, I can wait. Back now? Good. Enter Trex Warrior, a 3D arena shoot-'em-up released way back in 1991 in a similar style to 1980's Battlezone. It consisted of one programmer, one graphical artist and one musician. I'd love to see Call of Duty or Destiny pull that one off. It also only consisted of one floppy disk. I did enjoy games that did not require much, or more accurately, any disk swapping. Trex Warrior was published by Germany-based Thalion Software. Thalion were formed in October 1988 with the aim of creating games that were technically advanced. However, Thalion dissolved after all the developers left in 1994. They have a few games under their belt, but none that I've ever heard of. Anyway, Trex Warrior is set in the 22nd century. Back in 1991, graphics like this would have made it easy to believe that that was the case. You play the titular hero, out to avenge his own death. Man, they must have amazing healthcare in the 22nd century. There's also a cheeky little reference to another certain futuristic sports game that everyone was playing at the time. A reference that was almost subtle. Okay, no it wasn't. The graphics, certainly by today's standards, look extremely basic. However, the combination of polygons and pixel art are married together very effectively in this game. There's an obvious difference, but after a while, you just don't notice it. Okay, so there is the occasionally jarring over-magnification in the cutscenes, but this somehow lends to the overall feel, rather than detracting from it. On the Amiga 500 machines, there is the occasional bit of slowdown when there's a lot happening on the screen, but on 1200 there's none of that at all, leading to a buttery smooth gaming experience. Really everything in the game is as basic as it can be, but it's enough to get the job done. If you could put your early 1990s head on for a moment, you will realise just what an amazing technical feat this was. Your craft is controlled using the mouse to move and the spacebar as an emergency brake. This was one of the first games where I encountered that really incorporated using the mouse effectively for the gameplay. There is no strafing and no looking up and down, but these ergonomics really lend themselves to the experience of piloting a vehicle through the various arenas. Given the age of the game, and considering how slowly most 3D games ran back then, this is smooth and very responsive. The controls are very intuitive and simple, meaning that players will have generally picked them up by the end of the first or second round. The main area of play comprises of a robot-style open arena consisting of around 24 polygons and a pixel art horizon. They are very basic, but there are a few restrictions as to where you can go, which gives a real feeling of freedom. Each solar system's arena theme is very distinct, and each stage is different. It never has time to get boring. There are some interactive elements scattered here and there on each level, such as shield replenishers, springboards, walls and blocks to hide behind, pads that damage your ship and bombs. Most of these do not affect the enemy, so they can move around with impunity. However, the bombs can be set off by being shot at by yourself or the enemy AI, so beware getting too close to those. Also, someone was callous enough to allow the bombs to destroy the shield chips, and usually they are right next door to each other. It is infuriating when an enemy sets one off and obliterates your last remaining chance at salvation. The enemy AI is not very smart, but then it doesn't need to be. All of your opponents follow strict attack patterns that are easy to predict. But the thing that really ramps up the difficulty level as you progress through the various solar systems are the subtle upgrades they get and the combinations of enemies that they throw at you. Combine a mortar, a stunner and an assassin at the same time and you have a real fight on your hands. The enemies are actually quite well realised, with designs that make it easy to differentiate between them. Highlights include Speedy, hovers around and shoots occasionally, not very smart. The Launcher also hovers around and stops to fire heat-seeking missiles. The Wasp flies above the arena, players need to jump or get up higher, just plain annoying. Jumper always jumps in the player's direction, fires like crazy when you shoot at it. The Assassin, not very subtle, fires when it gets close to you and also goes full nuke when it's destroyed. Miner, fires napalm mines, hard as nails. Git. Mortar, fires mortars in your direction, even harder than the miner. Utter git. The Saucer, stereotypical UFO that moves around randomly. The Stunner, stops you dead in your tracks and then fires homing missiles. King git. The Cloaker, totally invisible until you get close. There are 3 versions of most of the enemies, each one slightly faster, tougher, or with a higher firing rate than its predecessor. That makes up to 30 different enemies, not including the champions. There are only a few upgrades available for your own craft. They do make a difference, but they're not cheap. You get money by taking out the opponents that teleport into the arena. When an enemy spawns in, the type is displayed on a small monitor in the bottom left corner of your screen with a timer. This timer slowly counts down while the opponent is active. When you destroy the enemy, the time left is converted into bounty and added to your total. Therefore, the faster you kill enemies, the more you get paid. When the timer hits 0, you ain't going to get dollar for this kill, buster. The only enemies that are not subject to this timer are the various champions of each solar system. You get a fixed bounty for these guys, but as they're all hard as nails, you're going to need all that time just to make sure you survive. As with many titles that did not require much storage, there is not a lot of music in the game. However, I do reserve a certain nostalgic sense for the score they played during the cutscenes. There is no music during the actual gameplay, but this is a good thing. You need to listen out for opponents, especially the likes of the Launcher, Mortar and Miner. If you mastered Trex Warrior, you could play through it in a few hours. However, it is not an easy game, and each stage is unique, leading to plenty of replay value. Knowing that you could probably beat the game more quickly, or not get caught out in quite as many crossfires next time. You could also buy the upgrades in a different order, which would make the game progression quite different. You can save the game between rounds, but there are only a limited amount of times you can save. Therefore, this also leads to having to be strategic about when to save. If you save loads near the start of the game, you're going to find yourself having to play through the rest of the levels very carefully. Personally, I would recommend saving each time either just before you take on the champion or when you go to a new solar system. At least this way, you are not caught out after defeating a champion and then dying during the next set of stages. Trex Warrior is only a single player game. If online multiplayer had existed back then, this would have made an already remarkable game absolutely amazing. But, like most other one-hit wonders, we're left wondering what might have been. Trex Warrior was an interesting experiment, and one that leaves a lasting impression. If you get caught out, You just want to go back in and get past the combination that finished you off last time. It is strangely immersive and compelling. If you could just stop scoffing at the graphics long enough to give Trex Warrior a try, I would heartily recommend it. You will discover a very playable game with a not inconsiderable level of depth and replay value. Thanks very much for watching. I'm the eager Amiga Eagle. See you next game.